We're going to get into the study of the Tower of Babel, and we're going to tell you what it wasn't as well as what it was. And I want you to understand that it was a religious tower. I want you to understand that it was not what we see in Sunday school literature, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, with a spiral staircase on the outside. And we were taught, wrongly so, that Nimrod and those people with him were building this tower to reach up to heaven to God. Well, it always struck us as ludicrous that anybody could think that. And indeed, it was ludicrous. We should have relied on our own feeling on that, because it doesn't mean that at all. We'll get into the correct translation of that verse when we get there. But what you want to see is that Nimrod, as I said last night, was Nephilimic. He was a Nephilim. He was one of those sons of God giants that we had in chapter 6, verse 4 of Genesis. And he came on through into the plains of Shinar. And there, which was a wonderful, wonderful geographic place, we have the Tigris, a mighty river, and the Euphrates, a mighty river. Now, those two rivers were two of the 4 rivers that came through Eden. Just recently, we've had some wonderful pictures taken. Don, I don't know if you knew this or not. I just got this out of one of the latest bars, the Biblical Archaeological Review, that they have been taking satellite pictures. They've got this wonderful camera that shoots down and goes under the sand, shows what's under there. Did you just recently, in the last 2 or 3 months, read about Egyptologists and archaeologists in Egypt who think they have discovered Alexander the Great's tomb? Well, they had reason for that, and there was an old city that he loved to visit, and he visited, Alexander did, just before he died, and it's all torn down now, and they just have a brick or two left out there. But what they did is they took pictures from up yonder and found the old caravan trail, which is not evident by looking. You just can't go and look and say, there's the old caravan trail. And it was used for centuries, but by using this wonderful camera, which somehow brings up these ancient paths underneath the sand. I don't know how they do it, but they do it. They showed that that's where it was, and that helped them find these digs. Well, just recently, as I referred to in Bar, talking about the 4 rivers in Eden, they have come up with what they believe were the river beds, not water on top, but the river beds of the other 2 rivers, not the Tigris or Euphrates, but the Gihon and Pison, and where they came and where they went down in through the top part of Africa there. Very, very interesting. Well, when Nimrod and the boys came on the plain of Shinar, and the plain of Shinar, of course, is what we know as Babylonia now, the word Sumer, remember I've used that quite a bit, this Sumer really comes from, I know it sounds like a little stretch, but it isn't, comes from the word Shinar. You see, every time you move from one language to another, you take some of the letters and leave some of the letters, and Sumer actually comes from Shinar. Well, they came down to the plain of Shinar, and it was a very interesting situation geographically. By the way, I had those things run off, or the ushers have them do the... Oh, okay, good. I got something for you tonight. Just wanted to be sure we had them. Wish I had a map, but I don't. I'll just have to tell you what it looks like. Tigris, Euphrates, Persian Gulf. To the west, which would be to this way for you, would be the Syrian desert. And if you go from Babylonia, or the Mesopotamian Shinar plain, through the Syrian desert, you're going to get over into Canaan. Remember the Fertile Crescent they always talked about? Well, the Fertile Crescent started here in the Tigris-Euphrates plain valley, and it went up north, started bending west up to Haran, where Abraham stayed for a while before he came on down into Bethel, and then it makes the crescent on down into the valley of, what river is that? The Jordan River. And that is the Fertile Crescent. So we've got this big desert on one side, then we have the Elamite desert on the other side. And so when Nimrod and the boys came upon this wonderful plain, it was so full of luxury. It was a great oasis, big, 150 miles long oasis, and it was really something. But it had a lot of wild animals in it. In those days, friends, the wild animals not only ate other wild animals, they ate people. That was a big thing. Remember the lion that came on Samson? This was a long time later. Well, the Lord even told the Israelites, he said, I'm going to give you this land, but I'm not going to get rid of the wild animals, rather the people just yet, because if I do, if I subjugate these people or you kill them right now, you're not going to get into the land for a while, and the wild animals will come into the land desolate, and they'll be there waiting for you. And, of course, that was a problem. So Nimrod, the mighty hunter, was called mighty, Gabor, the Hebrew word there, because he was the one that went in, and he was a great horseman, known as the great first horseman, went in and he started killing these wild animals, and that's how he got his name. The mighty hunter, man of renown. In fact, they made a parable of him. He was a parable by the time Genesis was written, you see. So he had all of this, and he said, now we want to go in. And then he decided, after he got his name for being a mighty hunter, he wanted to be a mighty builder. And he says, let's build a city and a tower so that we won't be scattered. But we see that God's plan all along was to scatter them, demographically, you see. But they didn't want to be scattered. The Bible tells us they were of one language. And now linguists are telling us. I referred to Dr. Merritt Ruland, the celebrated linguist, the other night. He believes in the thesis of monogenesis, one, Genesis beginning, one language, you see. Others also, Martin Muller, the great linguist as well. And it goes back to help prove the Bible that we were all in one place with one language, and as the Amplified Bible says, not only that, but one accent at the time. And then, of course, at Babel, not only do we have the judgment, as we talked about last night, the confusion of tongues, dividing of the language, which made the dividing of the people possible. Kind of hard to live with a group of people you can't understand. So it got possible for them to be divided into nations, as the Bible tells us. And then we talked about Pangaea, where God decided, well, we're going to make sure they stay divided, and divided the Pangaea, the unified supercontinent, one continent, into many, and separated by the earthquake. It came in Peleg's time, Peleg meaning earthquake. So understanding that was what was going to happen, I now want you to begin to think about the tower itself. Probably wouldn't hurt to take a note or two. You only have two options, notes or tapes. And if you listen to the tapes, you probably have to take notes too. So the next step in our study of Babylon is to consider the tower that Nimrod built. It's generally referred to as the Tower of Babel. We'll tell you a little bit about why as we get into the lesson. The Bible doesn't say a lot about it, certainly not as much as the curious would like, but it's briefly introduced and spoken of in Genesis chapter 11, verses 2 through 5, and I'll read those verses. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick, and burn them thoroughly. They did that so they would last. They had furnaces, by the way, and there in Mesopotamia we got a lot of digs, especially at Ur, which was close to Babylon. And they found in the digs, these wonderful tells, they found furnaces that burned brick. Burned them thoroughly, and they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. It's too bad they have to use the word slime here, because it doesn't mean anything to us. Slime is something on top of a pond as far as we're concerned. The word is bitumen, which of course is one of our words for oil, or the oily substance that comes up out of the ground, and they had that for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower, going to build both, you see, whose top may reach unto heaven. Now there is where the confusion has come throughout the years in our churches, where we said, oh, top may reach unto heaven. They're going to build this tower, and the top of that tower is going to be up to heaven itself. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We'll get into some translations here that are far superior, but just simply know that it means we're going to build a tower that's going to reach into the heavens or toward heaven. That's all that means. Not a problem at all. And let us make us a name upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. See, it surprised God. He didn't know what was going on. Okay, oh my, looky there. They're building a tower. They're going to build it up, clear up to heaven and find us up here. And so we're going to have to do something. That's what Sunday school said. It's not right. He said, we're going to go down and see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. Now, the following 4 verses, 6, 7, 8, and 9, speak of the confusion of the proto-language and the scattering of the people. Proto means first. That was that one language and one accent that they had. One of the things that will help us here is to see that these scriptures put the tower and the city in one phrase. I quote, "Let us build a city and a tower," verse 4. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. The two were being built at the same time, and the Lord was not pleased with either the building of the city or the building of the tower. The concept of tower, quote, the concept, philosophy, was begun by Nimrod at Babel. Many think that the motivation for building Babel and the building itself was an ancient one-time thing. As God interrupted Babel's building, and we surmise that it was never finished, we usually pile its bricks on the rubbish heap of some yet-to-be-discovered archaeological dig. Speaking of archaeology, we have not yet discovered the site of Babel's ziggurat. That's the real name to call it, instead of tower. We do have an extensive dig at Ur. Remember Ur? That's the place that Abraham came from. We'll talk about Abraham just a smidgen later in our study tonight. Very, very important. We talk about the stars and the zodiac. We got to talk about Abram. Well, there is an extensive dig at Ur, not so very far away from Babylon, that's given us the enormous ziggurat there. Could have been exactly the same thing as far as we know. There have been suggestions that this tower was the Babel Tower, but it's commonly agreed by scientists and paleontologists and archaeologists that it is not the Tower of Babel. Ur wasn't very far from Babel, and this alone gives rise to this kind of thinking. However, this does suggest to us that large ancient cities often followed Nimrod's lead and built religious towers in their cities. Now, let me really emphasize this. Nimrod built this tower as a religious tower. And when it says the top may reach up to the heavens, it doesn't mean anything about the height of it. We're going to go as high as heaven. No. It doesn't mean that at all. We're going to see it's going to talk about the zodiac. It's going to reach up so that the heavens, the zodiacal, is on its top. And of course, they built it that way because they studied the stars in the zodiac in those days. And that's what they built it for, and that was their religion. Okay, now, what I'm saying here is that other civilizations that followed also built towers in and around their cities, and they were religious towers. I got to get that religious in there because we're going to make a little inductive leap right here, and you're going to see that we've had a lot of religious towers built since Babylon. Each city had a chief god, and its temple was the memorialization, and the brick and mortar was the advertising for that god. A large symbolic figure, usually made of lasting metal such as stone or sometimes even of gold or silver, was generally situated in the temple. That's where we get our first idols. Our first idols. Now I want you to remember that the very first idol of deification was Nimrod himself. I think I mentioned a night or two ago that his wife Semiramis, when Nimrod died, it says that he died a violent death. Also, the old stories tell us that his body was cut up in pieces and sent to all portions of the empire. And there it was seated, and she did that to hold superstitiously, religiously, the empire together because now Nimrod was dead and she wanted to take over. And she did. Well, what she did then was she deified Nimrod. He is a god. Now, his body, his flesh isn't here right now, but now she had a child after Nimrod died. And this child, she said, was a child brought on supernaturally because Nimrod wasn't there in body, but he was there really as a god would be there. And so he impregnated her, and the child Tammuz, which is also mentioned in the Bible, came forth. And there we have the beginning of the mother god cultus, which is all over the world in every civilization and extant even today. So Semiramis did this, and not having Nimrod there in body, she put Nimrod there in form. First idol. And those who followed subsequently had to have idols as representations of the god. So that's what that was all about. Well, the main temple had the big main idol, but there were smaller portable effigies, and they were made by the temple priesthood. They made them to sell to the populace so they could have them for their homes and for their businesses. In fact, some of these small idols were crafted with leather straps so they could be attached to the harnesses of pack animals. This was for protection during travel. Do you have any idea of modern day? Yeah, I don't want to get too much into that, but I just want you to make your little mind up right there that even in modern day they do that with something on the dashboard, right? This was for protection during travel, and protection was sorely needed for bandits, made every trip perilous. Even though the city temple tower was named after and dedicated to its chief god, there were subordinate rooms provided for lesser gods. Finus Dake tells us of this. He says, and I quote, "There was a grand court and a smaller one, inside of which was a platform with walls about it, having 4 gates on each side. In the center stood the tower with many shrines at the base dedicated to various gods." Now, it's difficult for us who are dedicated to the theology of monotheism, one God, to understand the concept of polytheism, many gods, let alone practice it. We could never think of that. Yet this didn't bother the ancients, for they understood that the junior gods were under the tutelage and power of the resident senior gods. They were just helper gods. Bad theology. They often acknowledged that the lesser gods were actually the extension of and did the bidding of the Most High God. This had to be the case at Babel, where Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K, was the main deity. This evolved into a religious arrangement called the God family. We have it in our big religions today, especially one called the Holy Family. Same thing. Now, this caught on in other countries and other civilizations in following eras. In fact, the Holy Family theology is still around today. It's interesting to see that the use of the God family theology and the, quote, tower building philosophy has been perpetuated throughout history. Now, watch this as we make our leap here. The giant cathedrals and towering steeples of the middle centuries are the best example. These towering structures didn't represent the early days of Christianity. When the Apostle Paul was going throughout all the world in his missionary journeys, he didn't say build these big buildings with tall steeples and towers, did he? Didn't have them in Jerusalem, where the first church was. Didn't have them in Galatia. Didn't have them in any of the areas of the first couple of centuries of the church. It came later on. Now, in Omega Cometh, that book Don was referring to, and I wrote here some time back, it says, and I quote, "The early church in its pre-corporation days," now I call the early church the church today, rather, the Pearly Gate Syndicate. "The early church in its pre-corporation days gave very little thought to buildings. Somehow it muddled along from house to house with only a message and the anointing of God. As the millennium had come and gone, however, it was now time to think of home, image, and tall buildings. After all, God has blessed us so. Shouldn't we build a great building where we may worship and He may live?" Parentheses, heretofore, God had been allowed to move freely about the community. But from now on, He was remanded to the custody of the cathedral. Just like that, the edifice complex was born. And Gothic architecture was to become a Christian corporation trademark. When you heard the word Gothic today, you always think of Gothic cathedral, don't you? Although the style is different today, the edifice complex still lives in even broader Babylonian dimension. It is just as intriguing, I think, to notice the thematic decor of the cathedrals. To me, one of these themes stands out stark and severe. It's called the gargoyle. Remembering that the Nephilim, the fallen angels, the demons, were behind Babel. Nimrod was Nephilim. The whole plan was Babelian, Nephilimic. Behind Babel and its anti-God religious system, it's telling that the ziggurats of Zion, another name for cathedrals, have demonic effigies high and lifted up surrounding their structures. Now, this is the time I'd like the ushers to pass out the pieces of paper we have for you. Do we have two different kinds or just one with both of them on? Two different papers? Okay, pass out the two papers. You can pass them out at the same time. We'll refer to the second one a little bit later. But I want you to look at the one that has the gargoyles on it. I notice that this church building does not have gargoyles. I think that's nice. You're going to get a piece of paper that's going to have 5 or actually 4 pictures with about 6 gargoyles. I love what Oliver Herford said in his famous poetic declaration. He says, "The gargoyle often makes his perch on a cathedral or a church where, mid-ecclesiastical style, he smiles an early Gothic smile." Now, if you've gotten your gargoyle pictures, look right under the poem I just read for the ABC gargoyles there. You'll see that these are pictures, actually graphic drawings, of 3 that are in Paris, 3 different Parisian churches, starting with Notre Dame, and the last one is Notre Dame as well. The one on the right, which looks more horrendous still, is Germanic. That's the sculptured gargoyles on the Gothic Cathedral in Freiburg, Germany. Look at those demonic effigies. Now, they used to say that they put these gargoyles on the church as far as the spiritual reason was concerned. I'll tell you the physical reason in a moment. But spiritually, they said that this was to scare the demons away. Now, how these things scared anybody but the parishioners, I don't know. I don't think the demons were scared of these things, but I think a lot of people were. And if you look at that first gargoyle there on the Freiburg Cathedral, that sucker, if that doesn't look like Satan, I don't know what does. Now, I want you to notice something maybe you never noticed before as you gazed at gargoyles. Notice the mouths are open. All right. Probably what you don't know, because few people do, is that the practical purpose for the gargoyle on a cathedral was a draining water spout. The rain that came down on the cathedral was passaged away and came through pipes to the various gargoyles. You notice on the picture to the right there, you got 3 of them. All right, the water, the drain water, came out the gargoyle's mouth. That's the practical use of the gargoyles. Now, what's interesting, I don't think I have it in this lesson, but what's interesting, I told you Marduk was the chief god of Babylon. He was the initiating god that all of these others followed, Osiris, etc., etc., etc. That's a later lesson. But Marduk, being the chief god, didn't start off being the chief god. He started off in the evolution of the pantheon as being a lesser god. In fact, he was called an inferior deity of the water god. Now, it just sort of makes me smile to know that Marduk, as an inferior deity of the water god before he evolved into the main deity, and he's the one responsible for the effigy that was there at Babylon and the tower and coming through the Middle Ages to the cathedrals, and they put gargoyles to spit out the water. It just makes me laugh. You see, the very best they could do doesn't seem to be a very prominent reason, you see. When God judged the Nimrodians with the confusion of tongues, both the building of the tower and the city ceased. Genesis 11:8 says, "So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth." Remember, the earth is one chunk now. "And they left off to build the city." This last phrase leads us to believe that the tower was being built inside the confines of the city itself. We do believe it was. It wasn't off like the Sunday school literature shows, off on a field by itself. It was indeed to be part and parcel of the people of the city, undoubtedly their worship center. Drawings of the Tower of Babel that we see in Sunday school literature stand isolated and removed unto itself, are more imagination than fact. You see, they're never pictures, they're drawings. The religion of many ancient civilizations depended on the stars to display their theological stories, especially in the many cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, whole Babylonian area. Do we see this? The Chaldeans are the best example. The zodiac and its 12 constellations was the center of this focus. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the zodiac. Because of astrology, because the devil twists everything that God puts out, all of his truth, all of his activities, the devil not only has copied, but he's twisted, and then he has miscopied. So the fact is that it's hard for Christians who have very little discernment. Now, I say Christians who have very little discernment because if you came from the kind of background I came from a hyper-fundamentalistic Baptist background who didn't let the Holy Spirit do anything except one thing: convict those terrible sinners out there of sin. And when they were convicted of sin and got saved, then we locked the Holy Spirit up into a theological cabinet. We didn't want the fruit or the gifts. They just scared us to death. Now, the problem is that if you don't have discernment, which is one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians 12, then you're not going to know what is right and what is wrong. And if someone comes up with something that they say is from astrology and it's called the zodiac, you're going to throw the zodiac and all that it means or ever meant out, saying that's of the devil. You have no reason for saying that, but you just assume that's the case. And without real good discernment, you're not going to be able to undo that. That's what I did. That's what we did also with Pentecostals who said that people were demon-possessed. We thought the Pentecostals were demon-possessed because they didn't act right. You know what those Pentecostals did? I remember well in my First Baptist church. They didn't do the right thing at all. In fact, Nancy and I would go to church on Sunday morning before Sunday school. We'd pass this Pentecostal church, and they were already there. We went to Sunday school and church. That took about 3 hours, and we went home after that, and those Pentecostals were still there. We knew what they were doing. They were slobbering at the mouth, rolling on the floor, throwing each other around, and doing all kinds of licentious things, which were paganistic. Foaming at the mouth, of course, was something we knew came from tongues. And that also reminded us of rabid dogs, and we put them all together. And that's what those Pentecostals were doing. They didn't know how to act in church, because how you act in church is you dress up in your nice clothes and come and sit down and don't move. Do not smile, do not talk, do not blink. Your heart's allowed to beat and you can breathe softly. That's it. If Jesus walks down the aisle, you don't take notice of him. Unless, of course, he comes in a robe and a beard and dirty feet like he was when he lived, and then you ask the ushers to throw him out. He would have to come in a three-piece suit. Well, that's what happens when you get rid of the Holy Spirit. Well, the zodiac was not originated as a pagan or astrologic device. The stars and their placement have always been of God in creation and design. Satan has always attempted to subvert the symbols and the meaning of this heavenly display, yet this starry message is even clearer today than it was in the days of old. The story of the gospel has been unfurled above us from the very beginning. E.W. Bullinger speaks of this in the introduction of his book, The Witness of the Stars, and I quote from Bullinger. For more than 2,500 years, the world was without a written revelation from God. The question is, did God leave himself without a witness? The question is answered very positively by the written word that he did not. In Romans 1:19, it is declared that, quote, that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. But how was God known? How were his invisible things, that is, his plans, his purposes, and his counsels, known since the creation of the world? We're told by the Holy Spirit in Romans 10:18, having stated in verse 17 that faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word rhema, spoken word, rhema, the thing spoken or saying, sometimes rhema is called, that he says, he asks the question, but I say, have they not heard? Yes, verily. And we may ask, how have they heard? The answer follows, quote, their sound went into all the earth, gay, G-E, which is pronounced gay in Greek, and their words, rhemata, plural of rhema, their teaching, their message, their instructions unto the ends of the world, oikumeta. What words? What instructions? Whose message? Whose teaching? There's only one answer, and that is this: the heavens. The heavens. This is settled by the fact that the passage is quoted from Psalm 29. The first part of Psalm 29 is occupied with the revelation of God written in the heavens, and the latter part of Psalm 29 with the revelation of God written in the Word. It is a remarkable fact that it is in the book of Job, which is generally allowed to be the oldest book in the Bible, if not in the world, that we have references to this stellar revelation. This would be at least 2,000 years before Christ. In that book, the signs of the zodiac and the names of several stars and constellations are mentioned as being ancient and well known at that time. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 26, Revised Version, we read, lift up your eyes on high and see who hath created these, that bringeth out their host by number. He calleth them all by name, talking about the stars, by the greatness of his might, and for that he is strong in power. Not one is lacking. We have the same evidence in Psalm 147:4. He telleth the number of the stars, he giveth them all their names. Here is a distinct and divine declaration that the great Creator both numbered as well as named the stars of heaven. Then we have the term Mazzaroth. Let me spell it for you. M-A-Z-Z-A-R-O-T-H. M-A-Z-Z-A-R-O-T-H. Then we have the term Mazzaroth, Job 38:32. And we have also the word that's just akin to it and means almost the same thing, Mazzaloth. Instead of R, you put an L there, Mazzaloth. In 2 Kings 23:5. Now the former in both versions is referred to the 12 signs of the zodiac. That's Mazzaroth. While the latter, Mazzaloth, is rendered planets, and in the margin of the Bible, it says the 12 signs, zodiac, or constellations. Now, Job is thought by some to be the Jobab, J-O-B-A-B, the Jobab mentioned in Genesis 10:29. That would be the third in descent from Eber, and it might be. This is part of Eber's story, so it could very well be Jobab. Now, Bullinger recounts the testimony of Lieutenant General Chesney, well known for his excavation among the ruins of Babylon. And Chesney writes, and I quote, about 5 miles southwest of Hillah, H-I-L-L-A-H, the most remarkable of all the ruins, the Burz Nimrud, they have a place there called Nimrud from Nimrod. The Burz Nimrud of the Arabs rises to a height of 153 feet above the plain from a base covering a square of 400 feet, or almost 4 acres. It was constructed of kiln-dried bricks in 7 stages to correspond with the planets to which they were dedicated. Now, it sounds like he's talking about the Tower of Babel because it's exactly the same kind of tower. These stages were surmounted by a lofty tower, on the summit of which we are told were the signs of the zodiac and other astronomical figures, thus having, as it should have been translated, a representation of the heavens instead of a top which reached unto heaven, referring to the zodiac and the observation tower on top, not the fact they're going to build all the way to heaven. The term zodiac, I think, has often been a problem for Christians who have thought that it sounds so Eastern and so magical. Doesn't sound Western, doesn't sound Protestant. We had in our little town a bar called the Zodiac, and I just hated it, you know. The word zodiac itself is from the Greek zodiac, which is not from zoa, to live, but from a primitive root through the Hebrew word sodi, S-O-D-I, which in Sanskrit, a sister language of Hebrew, as is Aramaic, which in Sanskrit means a way or a path. Its etymology has no connection with living creatures that are in the zodiac, but denotes a way or a step, and is used of the way or path in which the sun appears to move amongst the stars in the course of the year. Now, I want you to think about God and Abram for a moment. God is going to come to Abram to tell him many things. He's going to make a covenant with him. He's going to have him circumcised. He's going to tell him he's going to be the father of many nations, da-da-da-da-da-da. And you've heard many times that God said to Abram that he was going to give him more seed, more followers, more progeniture than the dust of the sands of the ground or the stars of the sky. And we got kind of a bad translation concerning the stars, and I want you to turn so we can clear that up in Genesis chapter 15. Take your Bibles. King James here would be our best. I don't know what some of the others say. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 5. The Lord is speaking to Abram, verse 5, and he says, "And he brought him forth abroad and said, Look now toward heaven and tell the stars." Figure them out, understand them. Tell the stars, understand what the stars are saying, is a better translation. "If thou be able to number them." Now, we just considered that two things. God wanted him to look at all the stars and start counting and then decide he couldn't number them. Well, that isn't what he's talking about at all. This whole phrase right here is saying, tell the stars, understand what they are saying, and get their numbers right, because the zodiac is in 12 numbers and it goes in a circle. Tell according to the beginning down through till you finish at the 12th, tell the number, get the numbers right, can't go backwards, you have to go forward, because the zodiac tells us the complete story of redemption. Virgo, of course, is the virgin, as you well know, right on through. By the way, Bullinger, I don't know whether you have Bullinger in your bookstore or not, is Witness of the Stars. I've got 3 or 4 copies in my library, but you should get that. He does the best job. Now, Bullinger is the editor, author of the companion Bible that so many of you have. All right. Awfully good at this, and he goes into each of the signs and shows the complete scriptural understanding of each sign of the zodiac. Now, sometimes we have a problem with this idea of the signs. We go to a singles bar, and the guy says to the girl he meets at the bar, "What sign are you?" And we haven't liked that idea. But let me tell you that here again the devil has chosen one of our words. I want you to look at Genesis 1:14. Just go back to chapter 1. Flip back to the left. And 1:14 of Genesis says, "And God said, Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs." And then it says for seasons and for days and years. Now, if you know anything about how the planets move around and the stars change places as the earth moves and so forth, you'll understand the whole sidereal concept right there. But you'll understand that that word signs doesn't go with the sidereal movement. It has a different concept. A sign, a symbol, is a representation of something that it's standing for. It really isn't that thing, but it stands for something. Like today, we have the sign of the cross standing for the crucifixion. Well, these stars are signs. These constellations were signs. Now, if you think that's a little bit far-fetched, I think you better turn to Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3. Remember that there in Genesis, in 12 and 15 and 17 of Genesis, God is talking to Abram about his seed. Because Abraham doesn't have a boy and he wants a boy. And God's telling him he's going to have a boy. He's going to have a seed. And Abraham wants to know when. He's getting awful old and hadn't had one yet. And you know the whole story. He finally has one when he's 100. So he's talking about the seed. He said, you're not only going to have seed, you're going to have more seed than you can count. Well, in Galatians chapter 3, look at verse 6 to begin with. Even as Abraham believed God about what? What God said and what I just said. And it was accounted to him for righteousness. Know ye therefore, verse 7, that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. And the scriptures foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, listen to this, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all nations be blessed. How could the gospel be preached unto Abraham 2,000 years before Jesus Christ was even born? The gospel was preached unto Abraham in the stars. Tell the story, tell the significance. Look up. Tell the story, the significance, the meaning of what you see, and number them as you go around. The gospel was preached to Abraham in the zodiacus. Ooh, that's good stuff. Look at verse 14. That the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Jesus Christ, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. Verse 16. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not unto seeds, plural, as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed which is Christ. Don't get the idea that when God said, look up and count and tell, that he wanted Abraham to see how many. Wasn't that at all. The word there in the Hebrew is seed. Singular, not plural. Says right here in Galatians, seed, not seeds, referring to Christ. It was the gospel of the Christ right there, and it was preached to Abraham. Woo! And of course, I love the last verse, verse 29. And if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. Isn't that good stuff? Aren't you glad that's there? Woo! Now, the zodiac is a circle divided into 12 sections. Distinguished not by numbers or letters, but by pictures and names, these are called signs. The old almanac rhyme gives us the order. Let me give it to you. The ram, the bull, the heavenly twins, and next the crab, the lion shines, the virgin and the scales, the scorpion, archer, and the sea-goat, the man that carries the water pot, and fish with glittering scales. I know some of those sound a little far-fetched for you unless you know what they're talking about, to say, well, that doesn't sound too much like gospel. Believe me, it is, and it makes perfect sense. Get Bullinger's book, The Witness of the Stars. These signs have always and everywhere been preserved in this order. Why the order? Why tell the number and go around to be sure you get one before two? Because it tells the story of the gospel. Now, we always begin with Aries. I was born in April. I'm an Aries. They have been known amongst all nations and in all ages, thus proving their common origin from one source. Now, we're getting this monogenesis thing again, not just language, but the zodiac. These signs were afterwards identified with the 12 sons of Jacob. Joseph sees the sun and moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. You remember when he talked to his brothers about his dream. He himself, of course, is the 12th. That's in Genesis 37 and verse 9. The blessing of Jacob, Genesis 49, and the blessings of Moses in Deuteronomy 33 during his swan song before he died, both bear witness to the existence of these signs in their day. And it's more than probable that each of the 12 tribes bore one of these signs on its standard. We read in Numbers chapter 2 and verse 2, quote, every man of the children of Israel shall pitch by his own standard sign. The ensign is on the standard, ensign of their father's house. This standard was the Hebrew word degel, on which the sign oath, O-T-H, Hebrew word for sign, was depicted. Hence it was called the N sign, or ensign. We use that word today. Ancient Jewish authorities declare that each tribe had one of the signs as its own, and it's highly probable, even from Scripture, that 4 of the tribes carried, as they moved through the desert, carried their signs with them, and that these 4 were placed at the 4 corners of the camp. Now, if the lion were appropriated to Judah, and it was, then the other 3 would be thus fixed and would be the same for that same 4 that equally divide the zodiac at its 4 cardinal points. So we're going to see that the camp of the Hebrews and the zodiac are alike. According to Numbers chapter 2, the camp was thus formed. Look at the other piece of paper that I've given you. It's a square. Inside the square is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, Levi. Levi in the zodiac represents the scales, or Libra. Now look at the top of the square where it says east. Underneath east is Judah, and Judah's sign, the lion. In the zodiac, it's Leo. To the left of Judah is Issachar. That's the zodiacal Cancer. To the right is Zebulun. That's Virgo, or the Virgin. Go right straight down to the west. West is very, very interesting. We see Benjamin on the far left, and he represents in the zodiac Gemini. Then we see Ephraim and Manasseh representing the bull, the 2 horns of Taurus. And I just love that, because you know what the problem was, don't you? Jacob had 12 sons. His 11th son was Joseph, and his 12th son was Benjamin. When they went down into Egypt then, he had the 12 sons, but Joseph married an Egyptian woman and had 2 sons, and they were named Ephraim and Manasseh. In the 48th chapter of Genesis then, we have Jacob asking Joseph to bring his 2 grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to him. And what does he do? But he adopts his 2 grandsons. Question: what's a man about to die? And he was, that's why he said, bring him to me. What's a man about to die I want to adopt 2 more kids for, especially when he already has 12 sons? Well, the answer is very, very interesting. It had to do with the inheritance. Now, what you're going to see is when we talk about inheritance in the Bible, we're talking about land. This is in Egypt, long before Charlton Heston took the folks out of Egypt. Long before that. And the inheritance is going to be in the promised land, which finally, many, many, many hundreds of years later, it was. And each tribe then got its own chunk, its own inheritance. But here's what happened. When Jacob adopted his 2 grandsons, he had to set aside his son Joseph, as far as the name was concerned, to get the other 2 names in there. We couldn't have Joseph and Ephraim and Manasseh, because inheritances mean that the man dies and leaves it to his son, so he had to sort of set him aside, saying, okay, after you die, these guys are going to get, but what are they going to get? A double portion. So Joseph, his loved one, really is going to get a double portion, which was exactly what Jacob wanted. And it didn't matter to Joseph. It didn't matter to the rest of the boys, because they're going to be dead a long time before the inheritance comes around. They're going to have their grandsons before they ever get there. But when they get into the promised land, guess what? They conquer the promised land, divided up into 12 territories. Levi, the one there in the middle, was the head of the priesthood. He was not allowed to have a territorial state. However, he was allowed to have some land in each of the others, so he could roam around and have some land of his own, but not a state. It was not allowed then for Joseph to have a territorial state, and so you look in your Bible map at the land of the 12, and you will not find Joseph. You'll find Ephraim and Manasseh, and that's what equals 12. So we end up with 14, the 12 original plus the grandsons, but they only get 12 portions because Levi is the priest. He doesn't get any. Joseph has to set aside his own name so his 2 sons can get it, and so we have the 12. Now let's look back at our graphic. Got Levi in the middle. Look to the right. On the right-hand side there, we have Reuben in the middle. Now Reuben is the man, and that's the south, And the zodiac is the Aquarius. That's the sign of Aquarius for Reuben. To the left is Gad. That's my sign, Aries. I wish they'd give me a better name than Gad. But that's Gad. To the right of Reuben is Simeon, and that's Pisces, or the fish. Now let's look across the way to the north there. We have Dan in the middle. Dan is the scorpion, and of course that's Dan's sign. It says in Genesis that Dan was going to be a snake biting by the way. And that's Scorpio. To the right of Dan we have Naphtali, and that's Capricornus, Capricorn. That's in this zodiac. To the left we have Sagittarius. Aren't you Sagittarius, Nancy? That's right. You're from Asher. You dipped your foot in oil. If you read my oil book, you'll know something about that. Well, Bullinger completes his introduction to his book with a dynamic analysis. He says, quote, "It is popularly believed that Bible truth is an evolution from or development of the ancient religions of the world. But the fact is that they themselves are a corruption and perversion of primitive truth." Remember, the devil has twisted everything. Look how he took the most wonderful thing, love, and twisted that. In Genesis 11:4, where it says, quote, "Let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven," we find the seed of confusion. Now, the Bible itself is not confusing, but the casual acceptance of the King James Version rendering is confusing. The words "may reach" are in italics. Now, what that means, it's called an ellipsis. That means that those words are not in the original language. They are provided by the interpreter. It denotes the fact they're not there in the original text. The translator's interpolation has caused confusion and misapprehension for centuries. From this has come the concept of the fantasy tower with an outside spiral staircase that reaches up above the clouds on its way to the third heaven. This ludicrous but accepted teaching that accompanied this misconception is that God, when finally realizing what man was up to, hurried down and confused the language so that man couldn't reach heaven. That's what I was taught in Sunday school. This Jack and the Beanstalk theme has been in popular existence for generation after generation. In fact, I'm not so sure that the little fairy story for children didn't come from that. The New American Bible has a more acceptable translation of Genesis 11:4. It also furnishes an explanatory footnote. It says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky." Tower with its top in the sky is a direct reference to the chief ziggurat of Babylon, in Sumerian tongue, E-Sagala it's called, signifying, E-Sagala means the house that raises high its head. In the Dake's Annotated Reference Bible, the editor and commentator Finus Dake has his usual wordy contribution to the situation. I quote, "A Babylonian description of the Tower of Babel discovered in 1876, he's referring to the one at Ur, indicates there was a grand court 900 feet by 1,156 feet, and a smaller one, 450 feet by 1,056 feet, inside of which was a platform with its walls about it having 4 gates on each side. In the center stood the tower with many small shrines at the base dedicated to various gods. The tower itself was 300 feet high, with decreased width in stages from the lowest to the highest point. Each was a square. The first foundation stage measured 300 feet square and 110 feet high, and the seventh on top measured 80 feet long and 60 feet wide and 50 feet high. On the top platform, measuring 60 by 80 feet, was a sanctuary for the god Bel Merodach. Now, Bel is where we get the word you're most familiar with, Baal. B-E-L finally turned into B-A-L and finally turned into B-A-A-L in Canaan years later. Bel Merodach, they named him Bel and Merodach is simply Marduk. And it was a sanctuary on top, this 60 by 80 foot place for Bel Merodach and the signs of the zodiac. The builders evidently finished the tower, for the work was stopped on the city only, verse 8. One ancient Babylonian tablet reads, The building of this illustrious tower offended the gods. In a night they threw down what they had built. They scattered them abroad and made strange their speech. Their progress was impeded. They wept hot tears for Babylon. Now let me again say what I said the other night. Don't think that when we get these reports from the early histories on these clay tablets from Sumeria or Babylon, that these are in competition with the Bible. Regrettably, that many of them are older than the Bible as far as when it was written, but not older than the story they're writing about. And now if this happened, like the flood and this tower, then the pagans and everybody living saw it. And many of them kept their history and wrote it down. What we have in the Bible is the Shemitic, the Iberian, don't say Jewish didn't come along till a long time later, but the Hebrew account of what happened when God decided to use Heber, coming down through Shem, as his chosen people for the Old Testament. Now, they were just a symbol. They were just a prefiguring for the church, you see. He called them Israel, having power with God. And guess what? When the Holy Spirit came down at Pentecost, power with God, Israel was for all who were in the room and all who followed after. And I want you to know, I've been where that power's being poured out. I was under the spout where the power came out. And it's marvelous. Most of you have too. Now he finishes with this, and I've told you this before, he just confirms what we said. The builders were supposed to have been giants who waged war with the gods. Nimrod himself is called a mighty one, and the giants in Genesis 6:4 are called mighty men. These came from the fallen angels and daughters of men after the flood. And of course, that's what we've been talking about. Now let's talk a little bit about Marduk. Reason being, we're not so interested about the ancient idea of a Babylonian god unless it means more than that, unless it means something that we can see and experience and discern today. Marduk. The chief Babylonian god was named Marduk. The 1957 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica gives us a good description of Marduk and his origination and rise in the god pantheon. I quote now from the encyclopedia. Marduk, a late name of the god of the city of Babylon, who appears regularly in the classical Sumerian liturgies under the titles Asarludug and Enbilulu, like those? I especially like Enbilulu. Now that's just the Sumerian tongue. Asaru, Asari is a title of this originally inferior deity of the cult of Enki, E-N-K-I, at Eridu. Eridu is a city. As a son of the water god, a deity of lustration. His connection with Babylon, which is first mentioned as a small city by Sargon in the 28th century BC, almost 3000 BC, may be original and very old. Asarludug means, quote, Asaru who restores man to happiness, and describes his original activity as agent of Enki in all magical rituals of the water cult against demons. Inasmuch as the Sumerian pantheon has been universally accepted by the Akkadians who followed, and Assyria, which followed, Cappadocia and the Amoritic Western country, it was impossible to make Asaru one of the three heads of the Trinity. These were securely held by Anu, Enlil, and Enki. But the old war and sun god Ninurta, Zamanu, son of Enlil, was largely drawn upon to make Asaru also a sun god, and more especially the god of the spring sun. This addition to his original character as a Sumerian legend of creation in which Ninurta championed the gods against the dragon of chaos, the storm demon Zu. See these implications of Nephilim all the way through? The Hebrew transcription is Merodach. In the Semitic version of the epic, Marduk's birth and education are described. The old theological view that he was the son of Enki or Ea of Eridu is preserved, except in the Assyrian editions, where he is displaced by Ashur, no wonder, the grandfather for Assyria, son of Lamu. The legend of how he was unanimously raised to the rank of a great god in the convocation of the gods because of his magical powers to cause objects to vanish and reappear, and for his promise to go forth to battle with Tiamat. We had Tiamat last night. Tiamat, Kingu, and the dragons of darkness is one of the principal episodes of this epic. After Tiamat was slain and the dragons bound, sound biblical, binding the devil? Dragons bound, Marduk created heaven and earth, the constellations and planets, and fixed their movements. Now you see what happened. God put the zodiac up there. He put the whole thing up there. And at the beginning, Abraham, for instance, they knew what this was all about. Even long, long, long before Abraham, this was there. And the devil twisted it and made it part of paganism, not part of God. Upon the epic of creation and the myth of the conquest of light over darkness is based the Babylonian New Year festival. So completely did Marduk finally dominate the religion of Babylonia that he is chiefly known to Greek and Roman writers as Lord. Unlike other great and older deities, Marduk had no temples and shrines outside his new role in the pantheon, but only his original names and character as an inferior water deity of Eridu. I think the devil here, rather than perpetuating and perpetuating the name Marduk, he wanted to become invisible so that he could become confused and people couldn't follow him back and find out who it was. Now, in the Britannica article, notice the references to demons, the dragon of chaos, the storm demon, and the conquest of light over darkness. All of these are Nephilimic references. It's also important to see that the conquest of light over darkness is based on the Babylonian New Year festival. Compare this with the fact that the temple of Dendera, that's the one in Egypt, was mainly used for the celebration of the feast of the New Year. Add this to the use and veneration of the zodiac for both temples, and we see a strong affinity between Babel and Dendera. Finally, just a thought on the origination of the name Marduk. We have learned that Nimrod probably came from the Hebrew word marad, M-A-R-A-D, which means rebel. Could the word Marduk, with its strong similarity to Marad, tell us that Nimrod was really the namesake of Marduk? I cannot prove its linguistic affiliation, but if it isn't accurate, it's most certainly interesting. The companion Bible with its side-by-side notes by Bullinger agree with Dake concerning the zodiac. Bullinger teaches that the phrase, whose top may reach unto heaven, is better translated, and its top with the heavens. That is, with the zodiac depicted on it, as in the ancient temples of Dendera and Esna in Egypt. Now, I've got quite a bit to give you on Dendera, but I'm just going to give you a smidgen. If you want to hear more about Dendera and how it's like Babel, you'll have to get the tapes on this one. Just simply let me give you one paragraph and let you know something about it. The Egyptians much later on had a temple, tower, which reminds us of Babel in the sense of its religious use. Architecturally, there is little comparison with Babel, for the Egyptian pyramids, perhaps inspired by the ziggurats of Babel and Ur, were the towering structures, not the temples. The temple of Dendera is situated in a village of Upper Egypt. Here is the site of the ancient city of Tentira. The temple was the principal seat of the worship of Hathor, later known as Aphrodite, the cow goddess of love and joy. Well, we got exactly what it looked like and how big it was and so forth. And what's interesting is that when Napoleon went through on his worldwide conquest, he went through Egypt, you know, and he's the one that his people, he took scientists with him, they're the ones that got the Rosetta Stone. They took it back to France, and it was Champollion who's the one who discovered what the Rosetta Stone really was all about. And it was a stone that was put together with more than one language, and he was the one that deciphered the hieroglyphics. And he went there with Napoleon. Well, one of the things Napoleon had done too was that one of the zodiacs of this temple of Dendera, which was on top of it, he had it taken off from a chamber on the roof, and it was removed in 1820 to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it's there to this day. Well, we have a picture that was drawn of the Tower of Babel on the front of the tape package, and you can go back and take a look at it, and it's drawn correctly to all the specifications that we have, and you'll see that it was a ziggurat, not a temple, the Tower of Pisa. Now, the name Babel has an interesting history. It was not Nimrod's desire to build a religious tower named Babel. He rather wanted to build a city and a tower to, quote, make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11:4. The name Tower of Babel was given to this ziggurat long after Nimrod's time. The name bespeaks God's judgment on the people of Proto-Babylon, for the name is taken from the Hebrew verb balal, B-A-L-A-L, which means to mix, confuse, confound. The name was shortened from the noun Baal-Bel, B-A-L-B-E-L, to Babel, and simply means confusion. In the Septuagint Greek translation of the old Hebrew Old Testament, the translation of the word confound in the King James Version is in the Greek synkesis, that's a Hellenistic form, which means confusion. Later in the Septuagint, when talking about the city at that place, the Septuagint calls it Babylon, first time we see the word. The people who stayed at the tower site after the confusion of tongues and the division of the families, Genesis 10:32, weren't about to perpetuate the name of confusion for the tower, so a local tradition grew up that claimed that the name of the city and the tower was taken from the two words Bab, B-A-B, meaning gate, and El, E-L, meaning God, gate of God. In ancient cuneiform inscriptions, it is written as Babili, B-A-B-I-L-Y. In Old Akkadian, it is Kadingira and means gate of God. And I have in my notes referred to the study, Did the Nephilim Survive the Flood, for more on Dingir. Very interesting. We didn't cover it this time. In ancient times, judicial court was held in the broad city gate. From then, even till now, the word Bab, meaning gate, is the name given in the Near East to a seat of government. I'm going to stop right there. I've got more, but my voice is leaving me. My legs are getting a little spaghetti-ish as well. So, such a pleasure being with you. We appreciate it so much. May God bless you in your study.